Everyone knows his name. Everyone knows what he did. And almost everyone believes they know why. They say it was greed. 30 pieces of silver. A man who put a price on his teacher and collected. That is the version that survived 2,000 years. Clean, legible, morally satisfying. A villain motivated by money is a villain we can categorize, file away, stop thinking about. The problem is that the texts don't support it. Not completely. Not when you read them slowly, in sequence, paying attention to the details that don't fit the simple story. Because there is a detail in the Gospel of John that tends to get skipped over in the rush toward the betrayal scene. Before the arrest, before the silver, before the kiss in the garden, there is a dinner. A woman breaks an alabaster jar of perfume worth 300 denarii and pours it over Jesus. And Judas objects. He says, "Why wasn't this sold and given to the poor?" And John adds a parenthetical that reads almost like a prosecutor's note. This, he said, not because he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief, and having the money box, he used to take what was put into it. Stop there. Because something is being revealed that the narrative rarely slows down to examine. Judas was not a stranger recruited for a transaction. He was the treasurer. He had been trusted with a common fund. He had been managing the money of the movement for months, possibly years. And he had been stealing from it. Quietly, consistently, without being caught. That detail changes the shape of everything that follows. A man who steals slowly is not a man who acts on impulse. He is a man who calculates, who watches and waits, who has learned to present one face to the people around him while maintaining a completely different interior accounting. The betrayal for silver fits the profile, but it is not the origin of the profile. The origin was earlier, quieter, and far more revealing about what was happening inside Judas long before that night in the garden. Now consider where he came from. The name Iscariotes has never been fully settled. The most common reading connects it to Kerioth, a town in southern Judea. If that reading is correct, Judas was the only non-Galilean among the 12. That geographic fact is not minor. The other disciples shared a regional identity, a dialect, a way of reading the world. Judas came from somewhere else. Whether that made him an outsider in the group is impossible to know with certainty. But the position of treasurer, the person who handles the money so others don't have to, is often the position given to the one who needs a role that justifies his presence. There is something almost structurally tragic about that. And then there is the question of expectation. This is the part that almost no one takes seriously enough, because it requires imagining what it felt like to follow Jesus before the resurrection, before anyone knew there would be a resurrection. The disciples were not walking alongside a figure they understood to be the sacrificial lamb of divine redemption. They were walking alongside a man who spoke with an authority that had no precedent, who healed the sick, who commanded storms, who fed thousands with almost nothing. The messianic expectation of the first century was not spiritual. It was political. The Messiah the Jewish world was waiting for was a king, a liberator, the one who would break the Roman occupation and restore the Davidic throne. Judas almost certainly shared that expectation. All of them did. The problem is what happens when a man of calculation, a man who has already demonstrated the capacity to maintain a private ledger alongside a public one, watches his Messiah refuse every opportunity to seize political power. Jesus keeps withdrawing from crowds that want to make him king. He keeps redirecting conversations away from revolution. He keeps saying things that sound like defeat. The Son of Man must suffer, must be handed over, must be killed. And Judas is running the money, watching the coffers, watching the moment pass. There is a theory, not new but rarely given its full weight, that the betrayal was not intended to be a betrayal at all. That Judas was trying to force the moment. That handing Jesus over to the authorities was a calculated provocation designed to trigger the response Judas had been waiting for. The messianic uprising, the confrontation, the moment when Jesus would finally act like the king he was supposed to be. The texts don't confirm this. They also don't refute it. What they do confirm is the aftermath. And the aftermath is the only part of Judas's story that sounds completely unpremeditated. When Jesus is condemned, when the verdict comes down and the calculation goes catastrophically wrong, Judas does something that a man who simply wanted money would never do. He brings the silver back. He throws it into the temple. He says out loud to the people who paid him, "I have sinned. I have betrayed innocent blood." And they look at him with the same cold pragmatism that probably characterized the original negotiation. What is that to us? That is your problem. He had been useful. Now he was not. The transaction was complete. That exchange, that moment of complete abandonment by the people he had allied himself with, is the most under-examined scene in the entire Judas narrative. Because it tells you something important. It tells you that whatever Judas had believed would happen, this was not it. The remorse is real. The return of the money is real. The words about innocent blood are real. These are not the actions of a man who got what he wanted and is now performing regret for an audience. These are the actions of a man whose interior accounting has finally collapsed under the weight of what he actually did. And then he goes and hangs himself. The theological tradition has been divided about that death for 2,000 years. Some read it as the final proof of repentance without faith. A man who acknowledged his guilt, but could not find the mechanism of forgiveness. Others read it as the inevitable end of a man who had constructed so many layers of self-deception that when the last layer was stripped away, there was nothing left to stand on. Both readings are probably true simultaneously. They are not in competition. Here is what tends to get missed in every version of this story. Judas spent 3 years in proximity to something he never fully surrendered to. He saw the healings. He heard the teaching. He was trusted with the resources of the movement. He was present at the Last Supper, where Jesus, knowing what was about to happen, washed his feet. That detail in John's Gospel is almost unbearable to sit with. Jesus, who knew, washed the feet of the man who was about to hand him over, not as a confrontation, not as a final appeal, as a service. And Judas left the table and went to do what he had already decided to do. The question that haunts this story, the question that makes it impossible to reduce Judas to a simple villain, is not whether he was evil. It is whether he was unreachable. Whether there was a moment, somewhere in those 3 years, when something could have broken through. When the quiet accumulation of small thefts could have been interrupted. When the gap between what he professed and what he actually believed could have been named. The text suggests there were many such moments, and in every one of them Judas chose the interior accounting over the exterior reality. That is the real reason for the betrayal, not the silver. The silver was the price tag on a decision that had been made long before any negotiation with the priests. The real reason was a man who had learned so thoroughly to separate what he showed from what he kept, that he could no longer tell the difference. A man who managed the money of a movement he had never fully joined. A man who kept waiting for the kingdom to arrive on his terms, while quietly withdrawing from the one it was actually being built on. 30 pieces of silver was not the motive. It was the receipt. The real transaction had been happening for years, in the small, private moments that no gospel records. In the daily choice to take a little more than his share, to hold a little more in reserve, to remain just slightly outside the total surrender that everyone around him was, imperfectly, attempting. That is the tragedy. Not a monster, not a fool, a man at the edge of something extraordinary, who spent 3 years almost crossing over. Almost is one of the saddest words in any language. If this version of Judas, the one the texts actually describe, leaves you with questions, leave them in the comments. The best conversations about these ancient records happen when people who have read them carefully sit down together and refuse to settle for the easy version. And if this kind of investigation is what you come here for, the like tells the algorithm to keep bringing it to people who think the same way.